Hi there, every little body. It's Vicki. Today I'm working, or today, heavens, this has been about a month ago. Fabriano watercolor pad. I'm using my watercolor palette from Michael Wilcox, who wrote Blue and Green Don't Make Yellow. No, that's not right. Blue and Yellow Don't Make Green. And I'm coming in, I'm trying to be very deliberate because I have a habit of getting in too big a hurry and then I make a big old mess. I'm working with my pad on a little bit of a slant. The paper is dry until I add the water. I find I've got a little bit more control that way on something that's realistic, or sort of realistic. I'm not as comfortable with watercolors as I am some other media. Excuse me, I think I just burped. I wish I knew what these colors are, but they've been in this palette for about 15 years, so I don't. That's the disadvantage to using a palette like this, where you focus mostly on what the temperature of the color is, like whether it's a warm or a cool, because you do forget, and so many of the pigments look alike when they're in the palette. So, you know, for example, you wouldn't know if this was Daniel Smith or Winsor Newton in my case. Those are my two main brands. I've also got an awful lot of water here, but I'm just going for a real blushy look. Now this is where if I had waited just a hair for that paper to become like satin, I could have made those marks and the pigment would stay. It looks like I'm using a little bit of Quin Gold and maybe a rose. That definitely is a bluish red. That definitely is purple. And I just dab my colors in the well and don't mix them. I just let them hang out because I like having, whoa, it's okay, look how it's moving. I like being able to pick up a little more purple than red or a little more red than purple. And if you don't mix them all the way until they lose that identity, you can do that. That's kind of something I brought over from my oil painting, because you don't want to mix the colors to death. You want them to have their own identity and keep it. Looks like a little bit of cobalt or cerulean, and that looks like a little ultramarine. Anyway, just going to gray down that inner petal just a hair. I think for me, I've got to get into almost a Zen state. I watched some sumi painter, Japanese, Asian painter, and he was so slow and deliberate. And the colors are going to dry lighter, which is a good thing, because right now that rose looks like it's got a big old bruise on it. Leaving my brush on the paper as long as I can. These are Kolinsky brushes, so they hold a ton of water in the belly of the brush, but they don't release it all at once. They release it as you put pressure on the brush. And you will not get that with a synthetic. I use the belly more than the tip because I don't want to wear out those nice little point hairs. These are all made by hand, and the bristles are chosen, the hairs are chosen by the way they curve, and the short stubby hairs are in the middle, and then they're surrounded on the outside edge by longer hairs that give you a beautiful point. And when these are dry, they look all bushy. The minute you put them in water and shake them once, they come to a needle nose point. Little bit of green there to tone that down. Too much water. Mama bear, Papa bear, and baby bear. If there's too little water, your paint won't move. And if there's too much water, it gets mushy. Here I'm coming back in with a sort of clean towel. Actually, the towel's not clean at all. But this is a practice demo, so that's why I didn't talk while I was doing it. I'm trying to get more comfortable with watercolor. Because it's certainly not that I like the tools. Now, in some watercolor technique worlds, bloom, where you've got too much water and it's allowed to push back into the object you just painted, like that leaf I just did, those are no-nos. But then there are other schools of thought that like it because it adds visual texture. So you just find your own way. Just understand it, understand how to do it on purpose, and then if you want to not do it, you'll know how to do that too. See how that paint's changing its behavior now that the paper is a little bit drier. And I've got green and blue in my brush right here, so you can see how that color goes down when they're both there together. I typically mix my greens. Convenience mixtures are good, but you should also know how to mix them if you're ever stuck with a limited palette. That blue needs to be toned down. Just put some yellow in it. See, again, dirty brush. It's got blue in it. Just looking for variety. See, I'm getting faster now, and that's not a good thing. I'm not thinking. Now, sometimes that's a problem too. I just love watching what the paint does. Maybe I should have been a paint chemist. The other thing is you need to learn to use your brush from different angles because you will get a different mark depending on how far away from the ferrule you hold it, depending on which direction you put it down and let it drag away. That's about the optimal wetness that you're seeing right here. The paper is not shiny anymore, the water's not pooled, but you can still drop in color and it will blend itself out. One trick to get exactly the right amount of water in your brush is to dip it in the water. If you clean it, swish it around, whatever. Pull the brush out of the water, give it a real good shake, and then dip it in the pigment. And you can control the amount of water in the brush a little bit that way. That's a Charles Reed technique. I actually used that. My very first plein air experience ever painting in public was in Italy. And we were on the steps of an old church in Assisi, and a tour bus of Japanese tourists let out. And the next thing we knew, we were swarmed. And I mean swarmed. They were 4 or 5 feet deep. And they're not shy about getting in your space. So I put that brush in that water and slung it real hard. Guess what? They moved. It's a plein air tactic. Try not to use those points, the very point of your brush. It's okay if you just tip it on the paper very gently, but don't scrub with it. Unless you just like buying expensive brushes. A little bit of broken lines here and there. Let the viewer figure out what you've done and where you want them to look. Now the paper over here is drier, but it's not completely dry. Now if you wanted it completely dry because you were in a big hurry, then you can use a hairdryer on it and dry it. But when you use a hairdryer on it, you're going to remove some of the pigment's propensity to blend and the textures and granulation. You're going to force that to hurry up and finish. So if you just let it dry on its own, you get some interesting textures and backwashes and color mixing. I don't like masking fluid because it causes as many problems as it eliminates, because you've got to get rid of all those hard lines. But then I also have trouble leaving white spaces, so it's a dance. Personally, I like contour drawing better than rigid. Every shadow shape has a pencil line around it. That feels a little bit more to me like paint by number, and I think it restricts. And in that case, you paint one little segment and then you let it dry, and then you paint another little segment, and all your little segments are dry, and the difference in the shading is the tone of the color that you put in. And I prefer the more natural method. Nothing wrong with either one, but besides that, if I draw it too many times, I get bored with it and I don't want to paint it then. The Queen Gold in that first wash really makes that flower glow. And I'm painting this from life. They're silk flowers, of course. Flowers are tough to do, real flowers, because the heat from the lights and the lamp and just how old the flower is, it's constantly moving and changing. Silk flowers stay right where you put them. See the soft edge I just got there? That's a mark of that paper being not all the way dry. But the edge is softening on its own. And if it doesn't, you can come back in and touch it with a damp brush and make it. Put a little blue in there to give me a nice gray. It looks like it's a warm blue. I would have been better off with a cool blue like ultramarine, which are made more of a purple. A warm blue and a warm red will give you a little bit of a brownish cast, which in the case of a rose isn't that bad, depending on how old the rose is. I'm being remarkably deliberate for me. I'm going to give myself an A for being deliberate. You should always look at your subject matter more than you look at your painting. And I teach what I most need to learn. Mixing some orange with that red and that queen gold. Mixed that up pretty good, didn't I? It's got a lot of water in it to thin the color down. There's a fine line between being excited and getting in a hurry and getting bored and hurrying up so you can finish. I sometimes have a problem with that little dance. Sure would be nice to have some nice white highlights on those petals. But I effectively covered most of them up. Still kind of looks like rose, a rose. Very loose rose. Change color a lot, even if it's just barest hint of a hue change, which is the color. Like sometimes a little more gold, sometimes a little more pink. And then lighten it with a little bit of extra water. Lots of variation. Looks like I'm getting ready to dab it. You can also use a Q-tip. They're good to get into little tight spots if you want to lift a little bit of paint. And those little white dots right there need to be left, Vicki. Now I'm blending a few of those shapes. Okay, a few splashes. Tabletop, or the illusion of a horizontal surface, so that I can anchor those. And the bead of water, when you got that tilted up just a little bit, the bead of water can be tapped back into. Look at the nice drippies I got on that little thump. Okay, coming back in and gonna put a little bit of dark in that center to give it some contrast. Softening the edges now because I don't want those to look like outlines. Oh, taking a picture, so we must be thinking we're done. Sign it. I signed my watercolors in just plain old graphite pencil too, by the way. And that is all. Thanks for watching.